The land had gone dry long before the rain stopped. Cracks in the earth spidered like old scars, wide enough to swallow a boot heel. The cattle drifted through dust-hung twilight, ribs showing, heads bowed low like penitents. On the ridge, Elias Mercer watched it all, silent, unmoving atop a broad-chested roan whose coat shone copper beneath the dying sun. His hat brimmed through a shadow sharp across his cheekbones, hiding a face the wind had carved. Below, the lights of the saloon flickered dim behind dust-caked glass, and a boy limped through its door like he'd been shoved by ghosts. Tommy Mercer, age 10 and unspeaking, wore clothes 2 sizes too big and a boot twisted to fit a foot bent wrong. He didn't cry. Never did. Elias had taught him that much, if little else. From his saddle, the cattle baron watched a ranch hand guide the boy inside and shut the door behind them. The boy had come here every Friday since spring, like clockwork, and Elias had watched every time from the same spot, never crossing the threshold, never calling the boy's name. Some things, he told himself, were better observed from a distance. Inside, the saloon was quieter than most evenings. Poker chips clicked low, glasses clinked, and someone strummed a lazy tune from a corner stage missing a string. The usual rot of sweat, whiskey, and loneliness hung heavy in the air. Nina Blackwell stood behind the counter, wiping down a chip plate with a rag that had seen too many evenings. Her blouse was plain, sleeves rolled, apron dusted in flour. Her hair, coiled in a loose bun, had strands escaped like brush fire smoke curling past her jaw. She heard the uneven footfalls before she saw him. He stood near the doorway, clutching a tin spoon like it might protect him. No one looked his way. No one ever did, except her. She walked over, slow and careful, like approaching a spook cult. "Evenin', little man," she said softly. Tables open near the stove. Warm spot. He didn't reply, but his eyes, too old for his face, watched her like he was waiting for permission to breathe. She guided him to the corner and sat beside him, pulling a bowl of thick stew from the kitchen. It wasn't on the house, but she didn't charge him. Hadn't. Not once since that first time. He never thanked her. He didn't need to. His hands did the talking, gripping the bowl, lifting the spoon like it was sacred work, eating slow and steady while she hummed a tune under her breath. Outside, Elias sat still, watching the shape of her through the glass. The way she leaned toward his boy, how her lips curved into something kind, the way she waited until he was done before she got up. She wasn't like the others. She didn't pity the boy. She simply fed him like he mattered. "Don't get ideas," growled a voice behind her as she dried the bowl. It was Clint Hayward, saloon owner and lifelong cynic, wiping his own hand with a rag and watching her with narrowed eyes. Mercer ain't never cared for nothing but land and silence. That boy's a burden he keeps out of guilt. Nina didn't look at him. He's still a boy. "He's a mistake," Clint said, voice low. A ghost of that Comanche woman Mercer took up with. "You feed him like a pup, you might draw wolves." She turned then, slowly, and the look in her eyes made him step back. "He's hungry. That's enough reason for me." Clint didn't reply. He spat into the sink and muttered something about bleeding hearts. When the boy was done, she handed him a scrap of biscuit wrapped in cloth, slipped into his coat pocket. He took it without meeting her eyes, but his hand lingered, just for a moment, on hers. She saw something shift in him, something soft and terrible. Then he turned and limped away into the cold. Elias was gone from the ridge by then, horse tracks already vanishing into the dust. That night, as Nina closed up, she found a gold coin left on the porch rail. No note, no name, just a shine of wealth gone untouched by time. She held it in her hand a long while before slipping it into her apron pocket. The wind rose that night, howling across the plains like it had business with the dead. Nina lay in her cot behind the saloon, the walls thin enough to hear my scratch and boots echo in the street outside. Sleep didn't come easy. Her fingers still remembered the boy's hand, cold, small, hesitant. She thought her own child once lost, a memory locked away like a cracked music box buried in the desert. At the Mercer Ranch, Elias sat in the study with a glass of bourbon he hadn't touched. The fire burned low, throwing flickers against the portrait above the hearth. of a woman with hair like raven feathers and eyes sharp as flint. He stared at her until dawn. The next Friday, the boy returned. He walked straighter now, or maybe it only looked that way because Nina stood in the doorway waiting. When he sat, she didn't speak. She just slid the stew in front of him, along with a crust of cornbread and a cloth napkin. This time, she sat across from him instead of beside. She watched him eat, slow and precise, like it was a sacred ritual. "What's your name?" she asked, knowing he wouldn't answer. But still she asked, "Mine's Nina." He looked up just once, and something flickered behind his eyes. Not recognition. Something older, like trust trying to remember how it worked. She didn't expect him to speak, but he did something else. He picked up the spoon and tapped it twice on the table, then again. 2-2, a pattern, his own language. Her breath caught. Outside, the wind carried dust down Main Street, and the town's eyes turned, slow and unwelcome, toward the woman too kind for her own good, and the boy with a name tied to old ghosts. They didn't like what they couldn't control, and what they feared most was kindness with roots. The boy finished his stew and stood, but before he left, he placed something on the table, a smooth stone, flat and gray, worn by river water. He pushed it toward her like an offering. Her fingers closed over it as if it were gold. Somewhere in the darkening sky, thunder rolled, and far from town, Elias Mercer looked up from his ledger and whispered, "She's not like the others." His voice cracked dry with disuse. God help me, and so it began. The prairie stretched empty as an old promise, brittle and sun-scoured, with wind that hummed like it remembered better days. Nina stood outside the saloon just after dawn, apron still tied, sleeves rolled up to the elbows. Her hands were red from scrubbing pots, but her gaze was far, out past the livery, over the ridgeline where Elias Mercer always watched from his horse, where dust never settled and secrets stayed moving. The boy was due again that evening. She knew his pattern now. Every Friday before the sun dropped, like the day itself had stitched his silence into the routine, Nina had begun to wait for it, not with impatience, but with something quieter, a sort of reverence, like the way old hymns lived in the throat long after you'd stopped believing. By the time he appeared, dragging his bad foot behind him, the light had turned honeyed, soft as mercy. He crossed the saloon floor with his usual hush. The crowd ignored him like he was part of the wall. Nina didn't say a word, just nodded once, and led him to the same table by the stove. She laid down a bowl of stew, not too hot, and a piece of molasses bread he always saved for last. He watched her longer this time. Not bold, but different. Curious. She sat down across from him again, folding her hands, saying nothing. The boy looked at his spoon, then lifted it slow. 2 taps, then 3. The rhythm meant something. She didn't know what, but she listened. When he finished, he surprised her. He reached into the pocket of his coat and drew out a stick of charcoal, no bigger than a thumb, and began to sketch on the wooden table tiny marks, precise. A bird, crooked but clear. Then he pushed it toward her, eyes down. "That's beautiful," she whispered. "Is that for me?" He didn't answer, but he nodded. She swallowed hard, the weight of something forming in her chest that she didn't have a name for. Then she caught movement in the window. A figure, tall, rigid, silhouetted against the late light. Elias Mercer. He was closer than before, standing beside his horse but facing the saloon for once, not watching from a ridge, watching her. He left a few minutes later, slow steps kicking up dust. But the message was clear. He'd seen what passed between her and the boy, and he hadn't turned away. The next morning, Nina found something else waiting on the porch. A carved wooden bird, nearly identical to the one Tommy had drawn, wrapped in oilcloth. She ran her fingers over its wings, eyes narrowing. She recognized the work. It was Elias's. Word around town said he hadn't whittled a damn thing since his wife died. A week passed, then another. The boy returned, regular as ever. But now he stayed longer, ate slower, listened to her hum, sometimes tapping along. She showed him how to shape word with hands, signs for food, for thank you, for yes. He was clumsy at first, but he watched her with fierce attention, and the signs began to take shape. One afternoon, as they sat near the stove, the saloon door opened and the air shifted. Nina looked up and saw a man not from these parts. He was tall, with the lean, deliberate grace of someone who didn't waste motion. Dark hair braided back, skin sun-browned and lined by wind. His eyes, flint gray and unreadable, swept the room and landed on the boy. He didn't approach, just watched. Later, Clint sidled up to Nina, lowering his voice. "That's Jonas Greyfeather, half Comanche. Rode with the Black Fox Company during the border raids. Dangerous man. What does he want?" "Hell if I know, but he's been a skin about the Mercer boy. Says he's kin to someone long dead." The chill didn't come from the open door. It came from the name. Kin. That night, Nina walked Tommy back toward the edge of town. The stars came out slowly, one by one, like hesitant truths. She held his hand as they passed the blacksmith's, the church, the wind-split fences. She knew Elias watching the shadows. She didn't have to see him to know. She paused, looked into the darkness. "He needs more than stew," she said aloud. "He needs a father." The only answer was a creak of saddle leather, then silence. But the next morning, Elias walked into the saloon. It was the first time anyone had seen him inside in years. Conversations died. Cups froze halfway to lips. He said nothing, just looked at Nina, then at the boy beside her. Then, without a word, he placed a coin on the counter and walked out again. Nina stared after him. Her breath caught like a thread in a needle's eye. Later, as Tommy napped in the back room, Jonas came to her. Not unkind, not threatening, just blunt. "That boy's blood runs for more than cattle and ledger books. His mother was from my people. A healer, a voice between two worlds. She died bearing him. We thought the child was lost." Nina met his gaze. "He's not lost. Not anymore." "Maybe," Jonas said, "but the world don't much care for children caught between truths, especially out here." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Her stance said it all. That evening, a storm rolled in from the west. The air grew heavy, thick with static. As thunder cracked the sky, Tommy cried out, a sound raw and choked, the first real voice she heard from him. Nina ran to him, finding his limbs jerking, breath shallow, eyes wide with panic. She didn't think, just gathered him in her arms and pushed out the door into the wind and rain. Streets blurred. Doors slammed shut as she passed, carrying the boy toward the one place no one else would go, the Mercer Ranch. She didn't knock. She slammed the door open with her hip, soaked through barefoot, carrying the shivering child. Elias stood in the hallway, still and cold as granite. She glared at him, teeth clenched. "He doesn't need your money," she spat, voice trembling. "He needs your damn arms." Elias didn't speak, didn't move. Until he did. He stepped forward, reached for the boy. His hands, rough from years of callous labor, trembled as he gathered his son and held him close. For the first time, Tommy didn't flinch. The storm howled around them, battering the roof, wind like judgment. But inside it was quiet. Tommy breathed, slow and even, chest rising against his father's coat. And Nina, soaked to the bone, stood in the doorway, watching something impossible begin. Something like healing. Something like grace. She didn't leave. Not that night. And somewhere beyond the reach of lightning and gossip, Jonas Greyfeather saddled his horse and whispered to the wind, "The dead stir, Elias. Best you reckon with them before they speak too loud." The storm would pass by morning, but nothing would be the same. The fire had long since burned down to coals, but Elias Mercer sat by it still, as if the act of watching ash turn to ember might keep the past from rising in the smoke. He hadn't let go of the boy since that stormy night, hadn't said much, either, but the silence was different now. Not distance, not shame, just waiting, listening, trying to learn the language of a child he'd kept too far for too long. Nina moved quietly to the ranch house, hands full of linens and medicine, heart knotted tighter than she cared to admit. The boy had settled into a rhythm here. Strange as it was, meals by the window, drawing shapes on the porch with sticks, sleeping curled against the warm belly of the old hound Elias had nearly put down last winter. Tommy had taken to the mutt like he'd always known it, as if some bond passed wordlessly between the broken. She'd stayed. Elias hadn't asked, not outright, but when she tried to leave the morning after the storm, the boy had clung to her skirts and Elias had only said, "There's room, if you want it." His voice had been sandpaper and gravel, but something soft lurked beneath. She had nodded once. Still, not everyone was pleased. Rumors traveled faster than truth out here, and folks in town didn't take kindly to change. The idea of a cattle baron housing a saloon waitress, of a half-Comanche boy running in Mercerfields, stirred up more than dust. At the saloon, Clint Hayward grumbled behind the counter, polishing the same glass all day. "She's digging up things best left buried," he muttered to a drunk ranch hand. "That boy's mother near cost Mercer his land once. Now he's throwing open the doors to ghosts." The talk curdled into tension, then into threats. One afternoon, a stone shattered the ranch's front window. Tied to it was a strip of paper, crudely scrawled, "Outsiders burn." Elias said nothing when he found it. He simply gathered the shards, one by one, and fed them into the fire. Nina stood in the doorway, fists clenched. "You can't pretend this isn't happening." "I ain't pretending," he said without looking at her. "I'm choosing." "Choosing what?" "To stay the hell standing." That night, as Tommy slept, Nina sat across from Elias at the table. No plates, no candles, just shadows and a bottle between them. "Tell me about her," she said finally. His jaw worked for a moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. "She was called Sonny. Name meant the second daughter. Her people knew medicine, real medicine, old as stone. I met her during the worst drought we'd had in years. My men were dying of fever, cattle dropping where they stood. She came with herbs, oils, songs I didn't understand." He paused. "She asked for nothing. And you loved her," Nina said, not as a question. "I think I was afraid of her first," Elias said. "She saw things too clearly. Saw right through me. When the war bands came and men were picking sides, I kept her hidden. Said it was for her safety. Truth is, I was ashamed of how much I needed her." He looked at the fire now, face gone hollow. "She died birthing Tommy. I held her hand till the end. She didn't cry out, just stared at me like she already knew I'd fail him." "You didn't fail him," Nina said quietly. "You just left him alone." He flinched, but didn't argue. Outside, the wind rose, curling around the eaves like a whisper. Jonas Greyfeather stood by the fence, arms crossed, eyes on the house. He hadn't left town. Not yet. He'd been watching. That evening, Jonas finally came to the door. Elias answered, shoulders squared. "You know why I'm here," Jonas said. "I figured it," Elias replied. "His blood is ours. His place could be too. You've had 10 years to act like a father. I'm doing that now. Is it enough?" Jonas asked, "You think a few months undoes a decade of absence?" Behind Elias, Nina appeared. "He's not asking you to undo anything. He's asking you to stay in it." Jonas looked between them, unreadable. "You love the boy?" Elias didn't hesitate. "I do." Jonas nodded, but his voice stayed wary. "Then be ready, because love don't protect. It invites danger. And danger's already sniffing the edges of your land." Jonas wasn't wrong. The next morning, as Nina hung laundry near the barn, she spotted tracks, deep, fresh, too many for one horse. Riders had come close in the night, watching, maybe waiting. On the clothesline, someone had hung a crew doll, its face burned, its chest cut open. She snatched it down, heart hammering. That night, Elias opened an old chest beneath the floorboards of his study. Inside were deeds, ledgers, and a rusted tin box filled with letters tied in twine. Sonny's. Her handwriting looped in sharp angles, part Comanche, part English. Elias ran a thumb over the paper, as if it might bring her back. He looked up at Nina. "I want you to have the land behind the ridge. It's yours now, you and the boy." She blinked. "Why?" "Because I never gave him anything that was mine. Not really. And you made him feel human again. Nina pressed her lips together, eyes burning. She didn't thank him, just nodded once, like the boy did. Later, as the moon rose silver and watchful, Tommy came to her with a bundle of paper, drawings. One was of the ranch house, with 3 stick figures out front, one tall, one in a dress, one with a crooked foot and wings. He handed it to her and signed her name, imperfect but clear. She signed back. Home. That night, someone lit a fire on the property line, just enough to see, just enough to warn. And Jonas Greyfeather, standing watch from the barn, said under his breath, "They're coming." What they didn't know yet was who they were, but the land did. It always did. Dawn crept over the plains in red strokes, the kind of morning that made the wind feel watchful. Smoke still hung low along the fence line where the fire had burned, curling like a question no one wanted to answer. Elias stood near the smoldering earth, boots black with soot, eyes trained on the horizon. He didn't need to look back to know Nina was behind him. He could hear her breath, tight, steady, brave. The boy stood between them, half-cloaked in her shawl, his small hand holding tightly to hers. "They won't stop," Jonas said as he approached, his voice cut low and sharp. "Not as long as that boy's got your name in her blood." Elias didn't flinch. "Then we don't run." "I wasn't asking you to." Jonas drew something from his saddlebag, a carved totem, small and old. This was hers. She carried it when she walked the borderlands. He knelt, pressing it into Tommy's hand. "You're between 2 worlds, little one, but that's where the strongest roots grow." The boy didn't speak, but he held the totem close to his chest, his eyes locked on Jonas like he understood. By midday, the threat had a face. For riders crested the ridge, dust pluming behind them, not ranch hands, not law. These were men bought by fear and paid in prejudice. Led by Cal Renshaw, a rancher with a grudge older than the boy's birth. Years ago, Elias had refused to sell land Renshaw wanted. Some men held grudges tighter than land. They didn't shout. They didn't need to. Their silence was its own kind of violence. Elias stepped out to meet them, rifle resting in the crook of his arm. Jonas stood beside him, twin pistols at his hips. Nina stood at the porch, unarmed but unshaken. The boy behind her, peering through the gap between her side and the wall. Renshaw dismounted slow, his spurs hissing. "You know why we're here." Elias didn't blink. "Say it plain. That boy don't belong here. Not on this land. Not in this town. We're set to end things right. He's my son. Don't matter whose blood he's got. He's what's wrong with this place. Half heathen, half mute. Whole cursed." Jonas laughed once, humorless. Funny how curses look like children when you're scared. Renshaw's hand drifted to his holster. Elias's voice went low. "You pull iron, I bury you here." The moment stretched, a slow-drawn breath over cracked ground. The wind dropped. Even the grass stopped moving. Renshaw drew. He was fast. Elias was faster. The shot cracked like thunder across the plains, and Renshaw dropped to his knees, blood blooming beneath his coat. The other 3 drew, but Jonas was already moving, firing 2 rounds that clipped the boots of the second man and dropped the third. The last turned to run but caught a rock to the head, flung by a small hand from the porch. "Tommy." The boy stood now, full in the open, chest heaving. Elias's breath caught at the sight of him, not because he'd thrown it, but because he stood tall, like he had a right to. The gunfire faded, the smell of cordite thick in the air. Birds scattered from the trees, the world returning in pieces. Renshaw groaned on the ground. Elias walked him slow. "You came here to erase a child," Elias said. "Now you'll live knowing you failed." He turned his back on the man and never looked again. That night, the town was quiet. No one came asking questions. No one offered help. But no one came to threaten them again. In the days that followed, something shifted. Not in the world, not yet, but in them. Elias found himself building again. Not barns or fences, but smaller things. A carved shelf for Nina's books. A wooden frame for Tommy's drawings. every nail driven with the patience of a man who finally understood what it meant to make something last. Nina planted sunflowers by the window. They rose fast and bright, defiant against the wind. She began humming again while she worked, this time not to silence a scream, but to fill the space between moments. Tommy spoke his first full word aloud a week later. He said her name, not perfectly, not even clearly, but enough that she dropped the plate in her hand and sank to her knees, arms wrapped around him like he was the answer to a question she'd stopped asking. Elias watched from the doorway, silent tears cutting through the dust on his cheeks. Jonas left at sunrise 2 days later. He didn't say goodbye, but left behind a necklace made of bone and turquoise. Tied to it was a note in shaky English. When the wind comes for him, this will remind him who he is. Elias stood beside Nina as they watched Jonas ride off. She reached for his hand, and this time he didn't pull away. The ranch lived on, not untouched, but unbroken. And one evening, months later, as the sun turned the sky to copper and fire, Tommy ran to the field with the dog at his heels, his limp nearly gone. He laughed, loud, wild hole. Elias sat on the porch steps, whittling a new toy, the curve of a bird taking shape beneath his blade. Nina leaned against the post, arms crossed, a soft smile playing on her lips. "He's not just between two worlds," she said. Elias looked up. "No, he is the bridge." Elias nodded once, as if something final had settled in his bones. The wind rose, gentle this time, and carried their silence across the land like a hymn, the kind that stayed long after the last note. The land didn't forget. It simply waited. And for once, it had something worth remembering.